Hello, my name is Ruth McCambridge, and I have the very good fortune of being the editor-in-chief of Nonprofit Quarterly. And I want to welcome and thank you very much for attending today's webinar on the myth of overhead and the importance of understanding and advocating for the full costs of nonprofit operations. Our speaker today is Claire Knowlton. Welcome, Claire, who is Associate Director in Advisory Services at the Nonprofit Finance Fund, sometimes known as NFF, but we're going to welcome her more fully in a minute. First, we want to our sponsor, thank our sponsor, AccuFund. They have allowed us to provide this extraordinary resource to you today for free. AccuFund is a nonprofit financial operations improvement specialist. Their financial reporting capabilities enable sound decision making and better strategic execution of your mission. AccuFund helps organizations streamline processes, improve efficiency, and lower costs. On this topic of determining what your real full costs are, sometimes the devil is in the details. So we look forward to your questions, which you can log in throughout Claire's presentation by using your questions box to the right on your screen. You can log them in at any time when she says something that you don't understand how this might apply to you, or but you know, we are an organization that does not observe that particular thing that you just talked about. Feel free to log in any questions that you have. We'll take them up at the end of the session. The one question we do not want you to ask is if the webinar recording is going to be available at the end of the session, because it's always our most asked question, and it will be. So we're telling you that up front. You don't have to ask us again. Finally, we really want you to make liberal use of our hashtag, which you can see on the bottom right-hand corner of the slide that's up right now, hashtag Claire on Overhead, because we want for people to know that these resources are available to them, and when you tweet out something particularly cogent that someone is saying, or something that serves as a kind of a revelation to you, it attracts other people into this content and will let them know the kind of work that NFF is doing, which is going to be very important to the future of the sector. So with that, we want to welcome Claire, who is the author of one of this year's most read articles at NPQ, called Why Funding Overhead is Not the Real Issue, The Case to Cover Full Costs. Welcome, Claire. I do want to say that Nonprofit Finance Fund, we all owe them a huge debt of gratitude for over the years really modeling out for us what works and what doesn't work in nonprofit financial models. So welcome, Claire. I'm so glad you're here, and I'm going to hand this over to you.
Thank you so much, Ruth, and thank you everyone for spending this hour talking about nonprofit finance and talking about full costs. For those of you who haven't met NFF before, I just wanted to let you know who we are. So Nonprofit Finance Fund has basically three parts to our work. We deploy capital into the sector as a lender to nonprofits. Second, we provide strategic advice through financial training and consulting to both nonprofits and to foundations. And though we do work with organizations one-on-one, we are increasingly being asked to partner with foundations to support groups of their grantees who are facing similar financial challenges and explore those together. And the third thing we do is we provide accessible insights to the sector. So we raise up what we've learned on the ground as lenders and financial consultants and recommend practices that we believe will build a stronger nonprofit sector. Often that work shows up as advocating for more unrestricted funding in the sector. And certainly the ongoing conversation about the full cost of what it takes to run an organization is an area where we think there are significant opportunities to help improve the sector. So I'm very happy to be speaking with you today about just that. So full costs, real costs, true costs, fully loaded costs. There's a lot of different terminology that's kind of floating around in the sector right now, and it's being used in a lot of different ways. For a lot of people, when they use words like full cost, they simply mean program expenses plus overhead expenses. And that's where the conversation stops. But at NFF, we use the term full cost to mean much more than our day-to-day expenses. And so that's what we're going to explore. This little pie here shows what we think of as the full cost of running an organization. And each slice of the pie is not meant to represent that it's of equal size or equal importance to every organization, but rather think of these as seats at a table or voices that need to be raised as you're considering what it takes to run your organization. So we're going to dig a little deeper into each of these slices. First is total expenses, something that we're generally pretty familiar with. It's found on the organization's income statement, and it includes operating, kind of normal expenses, and those things that might be considered non-operating, stuff that's unusual that only happens once every few years. It includes depreciation, that accounting estimate of the wear and tear on your fixed assets. It includes the ongoing costs of impact measurement and some of the upfront costs of setting up impact measurement systems. It includes both direct program expenses and indirect or overhead expenses. They are all captured here. It doesn't include the purchase of fixed assets that'll be capitalized. It doesn't include repaying any debt. But we do think it includes something that we're calling unfunded expenses. By unfunded expenses, we mean those expenses that are not currently incurred. They're not paid in cash. But if they were covered, they would allow the organization to work at its current level in a way that is reasonable and a way that is fair. Sweat equity is a common example of unfunded expenses, overworking and underpaying our staff. So for example, if we have an executive director that's working 60 hours a week, and we hire a part-time assistant, 20-hour-per-week assistant, that allows her to reduce her time from 60 hours a week to 40 hours a week, so she can work more human and humane hours, but not do anything more and not take a pay cut. That would be an example of what we mean by an unfunded expense, something that allows the organization to work in a way that is reasonable and fair. Similarly, any sort of really underpaying of wages to our staff is something we would consider an unfunded expense. It's the sweat equity of the staff that allows us to deliver on mission in a way that's not really fair to them and requires extreme sacrifice. I think the fact that in our sector there are arguments about whether overhead should be paid, and the fact that we have such difficulty paying fair wages is the reason that we have gotten stuck talking about total expenses when we talk about full costs. It's so hard for us to just get our day-to-day expenses covered that we can't move on from there. But we're going to go ahead and move on from there and talk about what comes next after we have our full cost, our total expenses covered. So the next slice of the pie is working capital. And I'll say for the remaining slices of the pie, the next 5 slices of the pie, they all show up on an organization's balance sheet or are part of an organization's what we might call its capital structure, kind of its distribution of assets and liabilities. So for working capital, these are dollars that cover the predictable timing of cash ebbs and flows. What I mean by predictable is that for many organizations, we know that there is a disconnect between the time that cash has to go out the door, when we have to pay our payroll, when we have to pay our rent, maybe when we have to make some big purchases for a season of programming, and a disconnect between when that cash comes in, when our grant check is received, when our government reimburses us on a contract. So working capital is simply dollars that are set aside to be able to maintain business operations as usual. If receivables are late or if bills need to be paid early, working cap can cover that. And we think working capital is needed by all organizations all of the time. The amount that is needed by each organization varies. It really depends on your particular cash ebbs and flows. So for some organizations, 1 month's expenses of working capital, totally fine. Because of the way cash flows in and flows out of the organization, that's enough to cover you. That's enough to make it possible for you to continue your business operations as normal. For other organizations, they may have such a timing disconnect just built into the way that they operate that they may need 6 months in working capital. I've worked with an organization who does all of their fundraising during the holy month of Ramadan and in a couple of months that follow that. And because of the outlay of cash that has to happen in advance of that fundraising season, they really need to keep a significant amount of working capital on hand. Not because they're running deficits, simply because there is a disconnect between the timing of the cash receipts and the cash payments. Working capital should be easily accessible to management. And so by that I mean it should be in the organization's checking account or maybe in a savings account. But it's not something that is restricted or that's strictly designated. It just sort of ebbs and flows throughout the year. Working capital is not dollars to cover lost revenue. It's not dollars for unplanned expenses, and it's not intended to cover deficits. Our next slice of the pie is reserves. These are dollars that are used and eventually replaced. They are often board designated, and they have some very particular intention assigned to them. Again, the size and intention for each organization can be quite different. So here are some examples of different types of uses of reserves. An operating reserve would be to protect the organization from risk by covering some short-term deficits. So what happens if you have a bad year? What happens if there's some unexpected expenses? What happens if you lose some funding that you were counting on? What do you do? The hope is that you don't have to irresponsibly and suddenly shutter a program or lay off some staff. The hope is that you would have some cushion that gives you an opportunity to think strategically about how to best respond, so that if you do have to lay off staff, if you do have to close a program, you can do it in a way that is responsible. You can give your staff some notice of the layoff that is coming. You can communicate with your clients that their program is going to be reduced or eliminated and help connect them to other resources. So an operating reserve is to really provide that time for good thinking and stewardship rather than crisis response. Another example of a reserve could be a facilities reserve to maintain a building or equipment to pay for repairs and eventually pay for replacement. Particularly for organizations that own facilities, it is very important that there are some dollars available if something goes wrong with that building. What happens if a pipe breaks? What happens if a roof leaks? Does the organization have enough cushion to respond to that? That's what a facilities reserve would allow for. An R&D reserve, or research and development reserve, or what we might call an opportunity fund, is dollars that can be used for trial and error. If you're an artistic organization, to take some sort of artistic risk, to run a controversial show that may or may not pay off for the organization. For others, it can be funds used to investigate a new program or a new program approach, and to do so in a way that does not put at risk the core work that the organization is already doing. In other words, These dollars allow for you to try something new and potentially fail without letting down your clients and constituents. An investment reserve is another example, what might be typically thought of as an endowment, though in this case we're not referring to permanently restricted dollars. We would hope that those dollars could still be available to the organization in case something went wrong. But the goal of the investment reserve simply to be to generate revenue. So a pot of money that sits in an investment account that's carefully managed and that kicks off some sort of a return that can be used to pay for the organization's mission delivery. Reserves are needed by all, but the size and the purpose of those reserves is going to be different by organization. So if you're an organization that doesn't own a facility and doesn't have much in the way of fixed assets, a facilities reserve probably doesn't make sense for you. But an operating reserve probably makes sense for everyone. And certainly if you are an organization that is heavily funded by foundations and you are looking at a leadership transition down the road, for example. Well, we know that many foundations don't fund during leadership transition. So what are you going to do during that time? A reserve could be a way to help manage that risk or navigate that, that period of time when funding is gone for a year or lowered for a year. Reserves should be accessible to management under certain conditions, but they may require board approval to spend. They might require some sort of communication from management about how those reserves will be repaid. They can be held as cash in a savings account, or they can be invested, but they should just be in some sort of a format that can be liquidated within a reasonable time frame. So if that pipe breaks and you need to call a plumber tonight, hopefully you can access that reserve right away to be able to pay that plumber. So these first three slices that we talked about, total expenses, working capital, and reserves, are needed by all organizations and at all times. I want to stop there and Ruth, see if any questions have come in about this content.
Oh, absolutely. They're coming fast and furious.
Okay.
Bob Frady wants to know if you would consider volunteers as unfunded expenses.
So it's interesting. Would you consider volunteers unfunded expenses? So I would say volunteers, no, but forced volunteers, yes. So some organizations have, you've really built an infrastructure where volunteers are essential to your delivery. You count on them year over year, and maybe they're folks that engage with you for a short period of time. You have a particular fundraising event that they're heavily involved with, or you have a summer season that they do a bunch of work with. Maybe you have an internship program. You have something that is very structured and fair, and people are happy to volunteer their time and participate. That's fantastic. And that's something that I wouldn't put into that unfunded expenses bucket. What I would put in there is that forced volunteering. So, you have a staff person who is salaried at a pretty meager salary. They put in a ton of overtime. They do two people's jobs. They sort of volunteer their time for that second job. That's what we would consider an unfunded expense. And I've certainly, what I would recommend for kind of those organizations that say, but wait a minute, my staff are so hugely dedicated and they don't demand a higher wage, like they're happy where they are, and this is part of how they give back, is doing their job. I've worked with a theater company that had a similar experience. So they had actors that were very interested in giving back. They had full-time, pretty high-profile acting gigs elsewhere, and this theater company is where they came to really give to the community. So what that theater company did was they paid everyone equity wages and said, and if you care about the theater company and you want to give more, by all means make a donation. And so that's what I would recommend. You know, pay as you are able to, right? I mean, we struggle in this sector, so I think we're all trying to figure out how we get better wages for our people. But as you can, pay those fair wages, and then make it a choice for the individuals. If they want to give more, great, fantastic. Make a donation back to the organization.
That's a great point. I have a couple of questions here, and then I'm going to let you go on. A number of people have asked, which breaks my heart, how the heck do you start reserves when you've never had them? What do we do if we're close to our margin, and do we set aside a part of the budget? How do we go about even beginning to establish a reserve?
Yeah, yeah. And you know, I used to run a nonprofit organization, and when I came in, we were 6 months behind on payroll and had like no dollars coming in the door. You know, certainly had no working capital, had no types of reserves. So I personally identify with that struggle, and it's something that we were able to address slowly over time. So as we go through these full costs, they are going to be things that many organizational leaders have never thought about, right? We've been so stuck trying to just get our day-to-day expenses covered. We haven't been able to like lift our heads up and say, okay, and what else do we need beyond that? So it's done slowly, it's done over time, it's done through year-over-year surpluses. So one of the practices in our sector that is so damaging is for funders and sometimes boards to demand that we budget to a $0 bottom line. If we are budgeting to a $0 bottom line, we are covering our total expenses, but we are not setting aside anything for working capital or for reserves or for the other pieces of full costs that we'll get to in a minute. So yes, in your budgeting process, consider what those total expenses should be, and then also think about, and how much do we want to add to our working capital, or how much do we want to add to our reserves? And there's certainly a hierarchy of need here. So you know, working capital comes first. If you can't pay your people on time, and you have a pot of money set aside to take care of your building, guess what you're going to do? You're going to use that money for your building to pay your people on time. So even if you assign other intention to it, liquidity comes first. You know, having that working capital comes first. You know, as we've worked with organizations on calculating their full costs, the number can look very large and very scary. So what we recommend is take a full cost mindset. Think about these things, work toward them slowly over time, but also, you know, forgive yourself. We are a very undercapitalized sector. It's not you alone. So, you know, just add it to what you're thinking about and try and work toward those unrestricted surpluses.
Great.
Okay, so I will continue on to our next slice here. Debt principal repayment. So these are dollars to pay down debt. And that sounds like, oh, how terribly obvious. Yes, of course, we have to pay down our debt. But repaying debt doesn't show up in our income statement. So like when we look at our audited financials and we look at our statement of activities and look at all of the expenses that are there, the repayment that we've made on debt principal is not there. The interest that we paid on that debt is there. But if we've been writing a mortgage check every month, that only shows up on our balance sheet. And so that's why it's so important that we are able to generate surpluses, that difference between our revenue and our expenses, generate surpluses so we can do things like pay down our debt. So debt might be in the form of a line of credit, to, you know, an external way of getting some working capital, a mortgage. It can be loans from board members, you know, no interest, no fee loans, other types of borrowing. And debt can be a very valuable financing tool for our sector, but there really has to be a plan to repay it. And generally, that repayment comes from year-to-year surpluses. it's pretty rare that you will come across a foundation who says, oh, I see you have this mortgage. Let me go ahead and pay that off for you. NFF does a state of the sector survey, and we ask about funder dynamics. You know, what kind of conversations are you comfortable having with your funders? And conversation about debt, I think, comes in at like 1%. Say, I am comfortable talking with my funders about debt. So if we're taking out debt, we're really going to have to think about generating surpluses to repay it. Fixed asset additions. Again, something that if we make a giant purchase of fixed assets, it was a real cost to the organization, but when we look at our audited financials and look at our statement of activities, our income statement, it doesn't show up as an expense. It's something that shows up on our balance sheet, but it's real and it's something that we need to pay for. So by fixed asset additions, I mean purchase of new equipment, buildings, furniture, land, any sort of leaseholder improvements on spaces that you rent. Fixed asset additions are not the replacement or maintenance of existing fixed assets, right? We covered that elsewhere. So we save for that in reserves. We think about that in our depreciation expense. Fixed asset additions are also not small equipment purchases that won't be capitalized and then depreciated. In other words, anything that gets expensed wouldn't be a fixed asset addition. So this last slice of the pie, I think is in some ways different than the other slices, and we'll talk about this one in more depth. So this is what we're calling change capital, which is dollars for periodic reinvestment into the organization to change its business model. And by business model, I mean the way that an organization makes and spends dollars in service of its mission. Change capital covers the upfront cost of change and deficits along the way until our new business model is able to pay for itself, until our new business model revenue is large enough that it exceeds our new business model expenses. It should include funds for the launch and scale of revenue-generating activities. So if the organization is growing and changing and really just thinking about its programs, it'll cover those program costs, but it will also cover the cost of, say, bringing on another development person who will be able to help sustain the organization at its new size. So that's why I mean that the funds should include dollars for launching or scaling some sort of revenue-generating activity. For most of us, when we deliver on our mission, we lose $1 for every piece of mission delivery that we do. It's the reason that we are nonprofits. It's the reason that our sector exists. If we were able to make a profit delivering on our mission, I can guarantee that for-profit businesses would move into the space and generate a profit. And we do see that with some sectors like education or healthcare, where there may be a way to generate a profit on that mission delivery. But for most of us, we have to subsidize that mission delivery with individual donor programs, with planned giving programs, with special events and galas, with grant writing, with earned income ventures like thrift stores. So if we are going to grow and change the way we're doing our programs, we need to make sure that alongside we grow and change those revenue-generating activities so that they can sustain the new size of the program. Change capital generally comes in large, flexible, multi-year funding from an external source. This is something that you're probably not going to be able to save for through year-over-year surpluses. It may be something where a group of foundations come together to fund this big change. It may be something that you run a capital campaign for. Change capital is not self-funded or organic growth. They're just kind of the small changes that we have year to year or the incremental growth in our mission. That's not what change capital is for. So let's talk a little bit deeper about how change capital helps support business model repositioning. So to orient you to this graph, on the left-hand side we have dollars, and along the bottom we have time, moving from startup of a new program or expanded program to fully funded operations. The red line is our expenses, and the green line is our business model revenue. And by that, I mean the revenue that we have to work for, but that we can sort of count on, like the work that we do within our organization year over year, day over day, week over week, helps us generate that revenue. So it's not unusual to us. Where we want to get is right here, this purple spot, where our revenue exceeds our expenses and we are generating surpluses that can be used for our current needs and for our future needs. But in the meantime, we have to figure out what to do during this orange phase, when we have these upfront expenses that are not fully covered by our business model revenue. And so that gap, that is what is paid for with our change capital. And often this period from startup to fully funded operations, we typically see it take 3 to 5 years for organizations. Here's what it would look like to successfully use change capital. So we have our ordinary revenue in purple, and we have our change capital in gold. We can see a lot of upfront spending tapering off over time of that change capital. That change capital is replaced by ordinary revenue, and the organization eventually grows to its new size and is able in its final year to completely replace that change capital with its ordinary business model revenue. The change capital is not needed anymore. What we don't want to see is something like this, where change capital is used in the same amount year over year, basically to just plug a hole. So the business model never grew to the point where it could replace that change capital. I'm going to pause here, Ruth, and see if there are questions about change capital or the last 3 pie slices that we looked through.
Well, we're not up to change capital yet. Do you want me to ask the questions that are from before?
Maybe I'll go ahead. I have one more slide. I'll close out, and then we'll just take all the questions.
Okay. And in the meantime, everybody who's listening can enter all their change capital questions.
Perfect. Okay. So you may be asking yourself, well, how do I know what I need in each of these different pie slices? And so I've laid them all out here on this scale. Total expenses is not here because I think we are generally pretty comfortable with thinking about how we set up a budget and how we think about a budget. You know, we can look at what we spent last year. We can look at what we're planning for the next year. We can do some price comparisons out in the marketplace. We can look at some wage studies, and that can help us figure out, you know, what we think our total expenses should look like, and compare that against the revenue we think we'll be able to get, make some adjustments. But for the rest of these slices, many of us are not familiar with really thinking about them. So the scale we have here on the left moves from easiest to calculate and most objective, all the way over to the right of hardest to calculate and least objective. So starting with debt principal repayment, we know that this is pretty easy to calculate, you know, how much do I need to be setting aside for debt principal repayment? You can simply look at the loan agreement. How much do I owe? It's a pretty objective and simple way to know this is how much I should try and be generating in surpluses each year to pay down that debt principal. Fixed asset additions are another fairly simple one, especially when we're talking about off-the-shelf kind of things like computers or printers or things like that. You can simply look at some vendor quotes, do a little research online, and figure out what that's going to cost. Might be a little trickier when you're talking about some actual construction. So building a new building, for example, we know that vendor quotes are not terribly reliable, both in terms of dollars and the amount of time that it takes. Building a new building or doing some really significant renovations to a building can go over 10, 20, 30%, both in terms of dollars and in terms of time. So, you know, that kind of a fixed asset addition, we might move further down the scale to being harder to calculate and less objective. But still, there's something we can look at that's external. Working capital is also one that is fairly easy to estimate. And for working capital, you really want to look at a cash flow projection for your organization. If you haven't created a cash flow projection for this year, or if you aren't certain of how to create a cash flow projection, you can look at prior year cash activity and see what were my low points during the year, and you know, what were the times where I really struggled to pay my bills on time, and what would it have taken, how many dollars would I have needed to be able to navigate that space without a problem, to be able to continue paying everything on time while I waited for those other checks to come in. I kind of go back and forth between whether fixed asset additions or working capital should be you know, closer to easiest to calculate or hardest to calculate. I think it depends on you know, what kind of fixed asset additions we're talking about. When we move over into reserves and change capital, it just becomes a lot squishier. So for reserves, you would be looking at some risk analysis. You know, what are the likely things that could go wrong within my organization? Who are the funders that might pull out? You can look at some different sort of estimates, some scenario planning. If you're talking about a fixed asset reserve or a facilities reserve, you can have a systems replacement plan. So you can have an engineer come in and look at your facility and say, okay, your HVAC system is going to last you another 5 years, and it's going to cost you this much to replace. Your roof is good for another 25, but when you get there, it'll cost about this much to replace, on and on, so that you can come up with some, you know, some more robust estimates for that. And then for change capital, we really need to look at multi-year projections of the redesigned business model. What expenses are we expecting to hit and when? What revenues are we expecting to hit and when? And what's that gap going to be? And how long is that gap between expenses and revenue going to persist? So change capital you know, really needs to be flexible dollars, because so much of the future is uncertain. So just wanted to call that out. You know, some of these things are easier to think about. Some of these things are harder to think about. So Ruth, with that, there's a summary of key takeaways here. I guess I will just go ahead.
Those for after the questions?
Yeah, do you want to go ahead and jump to questions?
Sure. And I have a lot of them. So okay. I'm going to start with some of the ones that had to do with what you were talking about a little bit earlier in the presentation. And there were a number of people who wrote in and said that their contracts, their government contracts, they do require them to do zero budgeting. And what do they do about these concepts within that construct? How do they handle that?
Yeah. It's such a real dynamic, and it is such a problem. So the short answer is you got to find money from somewhere else, right? That in the short term, the government isn't going to allow you to set aside dollars for reserves. So somehow build that individual donor program, secure some foundation grants. I know that that's not a satisfying answer, but that's the reality of where we are right now. I will say that in terms of government contracting, it differs by department. And so HUD grants, for example, you know, I used to be an auditor. I audited five HUD projects. And part of the HUD contracts were they had to maintain a reserve. And part of what we audited was whether or not they had made their monthly reserve contributions. So that reserve was to take care of the building, right? That these HUD projects were providing low-income housing, often for folks that are, are seniors, folks that have physical challenges. And so if something goes wrong in the building, you can't just like boot everyone out and put them in a hotel. And HUD seemed to understand that and made it a requirement of their contract that reserves be in place. So I say that not that it makes your current situation easier, but that maybe there is some hope over the long term that government can move on this issue. That some departments already know reserves are important and others will come along with some advocacy.
Somebody wrote in talking about shouldn't we have the costs of having to shut down unexpectedly as a mandatory part of our reserves. And it's such an interesting question in what happened with FEGS in New York, because they actually they lost 2 programs, and in having to shut those programs down, they ended up losing quite a bit of money. And it's one of the pieces that put them over the edge into failure, and that was a $250 million a year agency. And in shutting down 2 programs, they were kind of tipped over. Not that they were in such a stable position in the first place, but can you talk a little bit about how boards might want to think about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much stuff wrapped up there. So, on the one hand, there is having dollars available to, again, buy you that space to think very carefully about what you do and why. And, not speaking about FEGS specifically, but about nonprofits in general, if you are having to make a choice about shuttering programs, you really need to know what the direct cost of shuttering those programs are. That we are very used to looking at our programs on an allocated basis. We try and get as many expenses into the program bucket as we can and out of G&A and out of fundraising because that makes us look good, right? So we're used to this very allocated way of looking at our programs. But if you're thinking about shuttering a program that on an allocated basis looks like it's losing money, but then you dig deeper into those numbers and you say, okay, which expenses actually go away if I close this program? I bet your executive director isn't going away. I bet your accountant's not going away. I bet your fundraising people aren't going away. Can you actually pay less rent on your building? Yeah, maybe not. What about your phone systems? What about the internet? What about the office supplies, right? What expenses actually go away? Who actually gets fired? What expenses actually become not incurred anymore? And when you look on that direct basis, you might be very surprised to see that shuttering a program that looks like it's losing money actually makes the whole worse, because the funding that was attached to that program is greater than the direct expenses, and it was paying something toward your indirect expenses like your executive director and your accountant and your rent. And now not only have you lost the program and those direct expenses, but you lost the funding that was covering the direct expenses and a portion of your indirect. And so, if an organization is doing this kind of analysis on an ongoing basis, awesome, that's great, but that's probably not true. What the reserves buy you is that time to do that kind of analysis so that you are making a choice that doesn't make the hole deeper, unintentionally.
People got very, very excited when you started talking about the idea of change capital. It really did elicit a lot of questions. And so people were, one of the questions they asked was, what kinds of efforts would attract change capital? You're talking about a 3 to 5 year period. Basically, somebody is betting on you being able to do something that you have not yet done. And so what would be the kind of change that that you've seen funders invest in this way?
Yeah, so the different types of change might be launching a new program, scaling an existing program, moving into a new geography, changing the way that the organization brings in money, launching an individual giving program, for example, where one has never existed before. It takes a special funder to do change capital. It takes a very trusted relationship. You know, it's a much different transaction than deliver this much mission for me for this many dollars.
Right.
Right? We're really talking about a journey together where an organization is going to reemerge in a very different way. So some of the work that I'm doing right now that includes change capital is for some arts organizations that are working in rural parts of the country, geographically isolated parts of the country that have to reimagine what it looks like for them to have sustainable business models. You know, for a variety of reasons, kind of traditional arts funders are not not interested in funding their geography. You know, so how do they continue to exist given that? Also working with groups of arts organizations of color, and similarly, though for different reasons, excluded unfairly from mainstream arts funding sources. So change capital going to them to develop new business models, new ways of raising money, and it's over 4 years, and it's extremely exploratory. You know, the funder has been just an incredible partner and very interested in seeing like what comes out the other side, rather than prescribing up front. Like, this is how you're going to spend dollars. Change capital won't work if it's sort of prescribed up front. You're going to spend here, here, and here, and these amounts, right? Because we don't know what's going to happen, and so it really requires some room for flexibility. You know, change capital is a good place for multiple funders to come on board. I'm working with an organization right now that is a child abuse prevention agency. About a $2 million organization just received $5 million in change capital for a real build out of what it is they do, and that was from one private donor, someone that they had stewarded over long periods of time. But the planning and the documentation and the thinking behind why they are asking for this change capital was extremely robust. And it's important to remember that, you know, change capital is not to fund what you do year over year, and it's not just to like pay your deficit because something didn't work right. It is to make a fundamental shift in how the organization is operating. And so, you know, change capital is something that an organization might need once every 10 years, 15 years, you know, maybe longer. Organizations might be able to continue for 20 or 30 years doing what they do really well without the need for significant change. So, you know, it's a special kind of funding. It's so that the organization like starts where it is and comes out the other side very different in terms of structure and delivery and how you make money and how you spend money. So anyway, hope I answered that question.
You absolutely did. We actually have change capital in our organization right now, and it's just a very different relationship with the funder than when you're working with people's operating funds, for instance. It requires something very different. So a couple more questions on this. Why the 3 to 5 year period? What's so magic about that?
I don't say that the 3 to 5 year period is in any way magic, and for some it could be sooner, for some it could be longer. This is kind of a typical trajectory that we see. So if you think about, for example, launching an individual giving program where one has never existed, and so we're going to do some training for our staff and our board. We are going to bring on a development director. we're going to hope that that development director is the right person, which often they aren't. But for this first 6 months, they're really getting to know the organization, explore the existing relationships that we have. Maybe in the next 6 months, they're going to start meeting with people, but can we expect that development director to be bringing home large checks in that first year? Probably not. In year 2, maybe we can get some. That would be good. In year 3, yeah, you know, that should be, like, we should be working. You know, if an individual program is viable for our organization, that groundwork over those years should hopefully pay off by that 3rd year. When organizations move into new buildings or expanded facilities, no matter how well we plan, there's just stuff that we can't plan for. The heating bill is higher than we thought it was going to be, or this particular space can't be used for the program that we thought it would be used for at the level that we thought it could because the bathrooms aren't enough to handle that. You know, there is a shaking out, there's a settling that happens within an organization while they figure out the right staffing, the right size of programs, the right mix of programs. And so in those, you know, first sort of 3 to 5 years as we're moving into a new space or launching a new line of business or expanding a program, you know, there's just some volatility in the business model that takes some time to shake out. So yeah, 3 to 5 years is certainly not a magic number. I'm sure you could do some sort of significant, amazing change in 2, and for some, you know, 5 years might not be enough, and it'll take 6 or 7, you know.
And I think this is a great question because we struggled with this one ourselves. Where does change capital show up in a budget?
Yeah, so what we would recommend is, and I'm working with the Child Abuse Prevention Center on this right now, you know, like how do we show this, this use of this $5 million gift, and how do we position the organization at the end of 5 years to not need it anymore, right? You have all this business model revenue that you need. So what we would recommend as a structure for the budget, you know, show your normal revenue, show your normal expenses, come to a surplus or deficit, and then below that show how much of the change capital you're using, and monitor what your runway is, right? Monitor how much change capital you had at the beginning, how much you've used so far, how much you've used this year, and like how much you have left, right? So that you're on track to outgrow that change capital.
And make sure you explain that to everybody, because otherwise you will confuse the heck out of people. They're not used to seeing that design necessarily, and so you really have to make sure that you walk everybody concerned through where does that money show up, and yeah, how do you justify it?
That's such a good point. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm going to maybe turn this back over to you. Can I just ask you one more question? This is a question we got from somebody, and I want you to think about how you would answer it. Where does the money from unexpected workers' comp or unemployment payments come from? Working capital or reserves?
Yeah, so great question. So that would come from reserves. Working capital, the intention behind working capital is not that it plugs a deficit or pays for an unfunded expense. That it's just supposed to like help you through the ebbs and flows. I said unfunded expense, I meant unexpected expense, but either, not meant to pay for either. You know, that working capital is just sort of like used and replenished throughout the course of the year. The reserves are those dollars that actually help you deal with a deficit, or actually help you deal with that sudden expense we didn't expect, you know, the workers' comp payments or whatever else. I have a client who had to downsize shortly before we started working with them, and had laid off a number of staff. Hadn't thought about the accumulated vacation time, and what they had to pay out in accumulated vacation was equivalent to 6 months of payroll. Huge. Not expected, right? So reserves are to help you weather that, that unexpected that happens kind of year to year. And after you spend down those reserves, you spend some years building them back up so that the next time something unexpected happens, we're prepared again. So if working capital ebbs and flows on the balance sheet, you know, kind of month to month, reserves would ebb and flow on the balance sheet on, you know, year to year, multiple years.
Okay, so I want to ask you to address one last thing in your sum up, which is the all-important question. So how do we sell these concepts to foundations and other funders? And with that, I'm going to, you know, stand back and let you sum all of this up for our participants.
Okay, so yeah, I'll do our little summary slide here and then try and address that tough question. Yeah, so each organization has its own and unique full costs. Some pieces of the pie are going to apply to every organization all of the time. Some pieces of the pie are not going to apply to your organization this year. Maybe they won't apply to your organization ever, but they're things that you want to be thinking about. And as an organization changes and grows and moves through different pieces of its life cycle, the full cost needs for that organization are going to change. The pieces of full costs that are really needed by all are total expenses, working capital, and operating reserves. And remember that covering overhead is not enough. It is essential but not enough. Full costs go far beyond overhead, which is just one piece of that total expenses pie. Determining full cost takes good thinking, not metrics. So unfortunately, there isn't a magical little formula that everyone can just plug some information into and like come out with your answers. Some pieces, even more than others, take some really deep thinking and bringing your expertise as a leader of your organization, your knowledge of the marketplace, your knowledge of the fundraising environment, your knowledge of community need. It takes bringing all of that together to make a reasonable assessment for what kind of reserves would make our organization safe from the most likely risks. Capitalization has a hierarchy of need. By capitalization, I mean the alignment of those balance sheet resources to the organization's mission. And so liquidity comes first. Working capital is more important than savings in an operating reserve because if you have those savings in a reserve but you can't pay your bills on time, guess what? It gets used for working capital anyway. So everything sort of falls to liquidity. So you want to make sure that that's covered first. And finally, covering full cost is a journey. It is not a destination. And if you can apply a full cost mindset and make progress over time, that's great. These concepts are new to our sector, and certainly just being aware of them, sharing them with your board, sharing this presentation with your funders, sharing my article with your funders is a nice way to start moving the sector further along this issue.
But NFF, you will be glad to hear, is already working on some pilots with funders to help push these concepts along, and they've been very effective in the past, actually, at being able to push some concepts about the capital structures of nonprofits along. So with that, Claire, can I ask you to leave the slide up that has the pie on it? Because we're being asked by a number of people to show that again. And I want to thank you. Thank you. I want to thank you, Claire, very much for this. I learn something every time I listen to you or read you. And thank you, all of you who attended today. It's been a great presentation. And please keep in touch and share this presentation with others. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.